When it comes to the Regency era, it's hard not to picture the elaborate parties and the charming ladies in elegant gowns with their dashing gentlemen suitors. Hit shows like Bridgerton and classics like Pride and Prejudice have immortalized the Regency era as a time of elegance and romance. But was courting in the Regency really as glamorous and romantic as it seems? Today we're diving into the history of the Regency era to learn the real story behind courting customs and etiquette during this memorable time period. But before we begin, be sure to subscribe to the History Source for more history content every week. Shows like Bridgerton and other period pieces do a great job of capturing a vivid picture of the period's aesthetic, and as a result, they've captivated audiences worldwide, making us dream of grand parties and timeless love stories. But the reality of courting during the Regency era was far more complex and at times less glamorous or exciting than what we've come to believe. It was a time marked by strict etiquette where every action, from a glance to a dance, had specific meanings and implications, and navigating the social norms of the era required strict adherence to a rigid set of rules. But first, let's define what the Regency era actually was, with a quick overview of the historical period known as the Regency. For such an influential time period that's become so romanticized in modern-day media, the Regency era in Britain is surprisingly short, spanning just under a decade from 1811 to 1820. The era got its name because then Prince George, the future King George IV, ruled as Prince Regent in place of his father, King George III. The king was considered unfit to rule due to mental illness, so Parliament created a formal regency with Prince George in charge. The Regency era technically takes place within the longer-lasting Georgian period, which spanned 1714 to 1837 and precedes the Victorian era. The early 19th century was a time of incredible transition and transformation in Britain, as the Industrial Revolution really took off. Meanwhile, Britain was also involved in the conflicts known as the Napoleonic Wars against Napoleon Bonaparte in France. While the conflicts took place on the European continent and the sea, it still had a big impact on society in Britain, including fashion, literature, and even the economy. Despite the turmoil, the period saw a flourishing of arts and culture, which served as the backdrop for iconic authors like Jane Austen and Lord Byron, whose works have endured to this day, offering sharp critiques and vivid portrayals of society at the time. The Regency was also defined by strict class structures and elaborate codes of conduct. This is something portrayed well in shows like Bridgerton. So why was the Regency so commonly known as a time of parties, romance, and love? Well, there's a few reasons for that. It's partially due to the Victorians, who later in the century started to heavily romanticize the era, kind of like how we romanticize decades like the 80s and 90s today, and feel nostalgia for the not-so-distant past. The Victorians actually did the same. In fact, while Jane Austen was successful during her lifetime, it wouldn't be until the late Victorian that she became the iconic author that she's considered today. With works like Pride and Prejudice becoming bestsellers decades later, it would be the equivalent of a book that came out in the 1950s suddenly becoming a must-read novel. There was also political reasons behind the era's famous lavish gatherings. Due to the Napoleonic Wars, travel across Europe was restricted by conflict and military blockades, forcing the British upper classes to stay home more often. As a result, they sought entertainment through extravagant parties and more frequent social events. This trend was part of a broader cultural development in the Regency era, which saw a rise in gatherings, fashion, and social rituals as the aristocracy embraced new ways to flaunt their status and wealth in Britain. So say you were ready to get into the marriage market. Where would you go to meet someone? Well, today you can just download an app from the comfort of your couch and find a date while lounging in your pajamas watching Netflix and eating cookies. Back in the Regency, you didn't have such luxuries. Meeting potential matches was highly structured and followed a strict code of conduct. Dating as we know it didn't exist. Balls, dinners, and social gatherings weren't just for fun. They were essential for making advantageous connections and securing one's social standing. For the upper classes, the most prominent of these events were balls, where the glittering elite gathered to socialize, dance, and hopefully find a suitable match. Balls were grand affairs, often held in lavish homes or dance halls. These events were the highlight of the social calendar, offering an opportunity for young people to socialize outside, under the watchful eyes of their families and chaperones, of course. Introductions at these gatherings were a formal affair. While nowadays it's common to DM someone you find attractive, it was not proper at all for a gentleman to approach a lady without a formal introduction by a mutual acquaintance. This ensured that social propriety was always maintained. Once introductions were made, polite conversation could follow. Topics like hobbies, fashion, and literature were considered appropriate. Gossiping about others was considered impolite and bad manners, but you could discuss mutual friends and acquaintances as long as it was in a positive light, and it was a common way to build connection and further demonstrate one's social status. Besides gossip, topics like politics or personal finance were considered too controversial and outside the boundaries of polite conversation in society. Besides polite conversation, dancing was the primary means of social interaction. In the Regency period, the dance floor was a place for courtship. Each dance was an opportunity to converse alone and make a good impression. It's important to understand dances at this time were not just 2 or 3 minutes as seen in modern portrayals. Dances sometimes lasted up to 20 minutes with highly choreographed moves that were carried out in different stages. This is why it was such an effective way to get to know someone. Dance etiquette dictated that a gentleman could not request more than 2 dances with the same lady, as this would come off as too forward, and a lady also had to be mindful of how many times she danced with any one gentleman. The dance card was essential for this. It was a small booklet carried by ladies that listed the names of their dance partners for each dance. Securing a spot on a lady's dance card was a sign of favor, and gentlemen suitors often competed for the privilege of the first or last dance. But meeting someone was just the first step in the elaborate dance of Regency courtship. So let's say you met someone at the ball who sparked your interest. What happened next? Well, that's where the etiquette and rules of calling on someone come into play. The first step to start courting officially was calling on someone. Gentlemen would visit the home of ladies they were interested in. But these visits were not casual drop-ins. They also followed strict social protocols. A gentleman's interest in a lady would first be expressed by dropping off his calling card to her home, and he would always be the one to call. A single lady would absolutely never call on a bachelor. It would be customary for the gentleman to be received by the lady's footman at the door and leave his card. Once the calling card was received, it was up to the lady's family, particularly her mother, to decide if the gentleman's visit would be welcomed. If the visit was accepted, a specific time would be arranged, and this process ensured the lady's family had control over who visited, safeguarding her reputation. Upon arriving at the lady's home, the gentleman would be received in the drawing room, a space specifically designed for these types of interactions. The lady would be accompanied by a chaperone, typically an older female relative or trusted family friend. Reputation in Regency society was everything. A gentleman's behavior during a call was closely observed, and any misstep could tarnish his reputation and ruin his chances, so it was crucial to maintain proper decorum at all times. Politeness, respect, and adherence to social customs were crucial. Acceptable activities during a call were limited but meaningful. They might engage in activities such as playing the piano, playing cards, or discussing literature. These activities allowed them to get to know each other better within the bounds of social propriety. The duration of a call was also regulated. A typical call lasted only about half an hour. Overstaying was considered impolite and could be interpreted as a lack of respect for the lady's time and her family. Gentlemen had to be mindful of not only the length of their visit, but also the frequency. Too frequent could be seen as too forward, while too infrequent might suggest a lack of interest. If the lady and gentleman and their respective families found the match suitable, it would progress to the full courting stage. This was known as walking out, basically the Regency era equivalent of making your relationship public. At this point in courting, the two could spend time together in public, but again, always in the presence of a chaperone. Walking out typically involves strolls in public parks or gardens. This is depicted in Bridgerton frequently as promenading. Promenading allowed couples to be seen together, signaling their mutual interest to society and enjoying each other's company, all under the watchful eyes of the public and the ever-present chaperone, of course. Chaperones played a crucial role during these outings. Their presence ensured propriety was maintained, but a good chaperone would observe discreetly while allowing the couple some level of privacy. At this point, it would also be allowed to exchange letters, and these letters were a vital aspect of Regency courtship, because it was the only private means of communication. While conversation in person was to maintain the strictest decorum, these letters allowed room for more romantic sentiments, but it wasn't uncommon for the lady's family to review and approve the correspondence to ensure it didn't say anything improper. The length of courting could vary based on social class and other factors. A few months would be accepted, and even up to a year was normal. If the gentleman and lady felt they weren't suitable for each other, then both parties would try and end it without any scandal or gossip to maintain their social standings. But if things did work, and the gentleman was ready to propose, then he first needed to seek permission from the lady's father or guardian. Class and family standing played a big role in the approval process. A man's prospects, family background, and reputation were all scrutinized. Similarly, the lady's family would consider her dowry and how the marriage would benefit their social position. For upper class families, this was not merely a matter of love, but a strategic alliance that could elevate both families' status. If the father or guardian approved, then a marriage settlement could be drafted. Marriage settlements and dowries were an important part of the process. It was a legally binding document that outlined the financial arrangement between the two families. It included the dowry, which was the money and property that the bride's family would provide to the groom, and these arrangements were crucial to ensuring that the financial aspects of the marriage were clearly defined. After these considerations were determined, a formal proposal could be made. Public announcements of the engagement were typically made in local newspapers and social registers. These announcements served to inform society of the upcoming union and to cement the social standing of the couple. It was an important step in making the engagement official and widely recognized. Weddings in the Regency era were grand affairs, reflecting the status and wealth of the families involved. The ceremonies were often held in local churches, followed by lavish receptions at the family home. Much like today, the bride and groom would exchange vows in front of their families and friends, marking the formal beginning of their life together. So, do you think you'd like to court or be courted in the Regency era? If you enjoyed this look at the history of Regency era courtship, then be sure to like the video and subscribe for more exciting history content about how people lived in the past.